Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Kim, thank you for your gracious introduction. Thank you for your friendship, but above all, thank you for your leadership, both as the past president of AJC in Central New Jersey and as a member of its Executive Council, as well as to John Rosen, the director of AJC's office in New Jersey. To your president, Stanley Bergman, I appreciate his leadership. And I must tell you, my mother, when she was alive, said, if you can say something nice, say it, if not, be quiet. To your incredibly talented and globally respected executive director, David Harris. He's just an extraordinary person. To the many dignitaries from around the world participating in this year's forum, and to all my friends, particularly from New Jersey, who have come to the nation's capital, we appreciate that you have always stood strong for the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also on a host of domestic issues, which you have taken incredibly important positions on. I especially want to recognize the good work that all of you in the AJC do every day around the world to promote diplomacy, advocate for reason and logic and fairness, and the unique importance of what the AJC has always stood for. Now, whenever I speak about U.S. foreign policy, I always ask and like to share with my audience the two questions that I ask myself as it relates to what should the U.S. foreign policy be anywhere in the world. And those two questions are, what is in the national interests of the United States? What is in the national security interests of the United States? And the answer to those two questions dictate my advocacy, my views, my votes, and my policy. And for 23 years, between the time in the House of Representatives and now for the last 9 in the United States Senate, I have answered that question as it relates to the Middle East by saying it is in the national interest and security of the United States to have a strong, unwavering relationship with the State of Israel, the one true democracy in a sea of autocracy, a major security ally of the United States, a major trading partner of the United States, and the one country most likely to be voting with us in common cause in international forums. And that is how I have advocated for the last 23 years. Now, one thing that I know is clear is that that national security interest is incredibly important with our ally, the State of Israel. It's why we can never allow any nation, never allow any group to question the legitimacy of Israel or the faith of the Jewish people. Israel has a right to exist in peace and security as the homeland for the Jewish people. Even now, record numbers of European Jews are making their decision to make Aliyah to Israel, a country that has always stood for justice and protection in a world that even now is filled with anti-Semitism, brutality, ignorance, and suffering. Unfortunately, we've seen examples of anti-Semitism everywhere. Last year in May, a gunman killed 4 people when he opened fire at the Jewish Museum of Belgium in Brussels. In July, Molotov cocktails were thrown at the synagogue in Germany, which had been burned to the ground by the Nazis during the 1938 Kristallnacht and was rebuilt as recently as 2002. This year, as we all know, on January 9th, 4 members of France's Jewish community were murdered in an attack on a kosher supermarket following the terrorist attack on the Paris offices of newspaper Charlie Hebdo. Anti-Semitism is alive in too many places, and hatred and intolerance continues against the Jewish people. It's why I introduced, and on Thursday the Senate passed, my bipartisan resolution condemning anti-Semitism. It calls upon the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the government agencies to work closely with the European Union and European governments to address the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. It calls on European governments not only to stand against anti-Semitism, but to stand united to end it. Stand together, all of us, to investigate every incident of violence motivated by anti-Semitism. designates senior-level special envoys to monitor and combat anti-Semitism everywhere, and to enhance national strategies to combat and monitor anti-Semitism and all hate crimes by better training law enforcement to recognize it, act upon it, collect relevant data to trace it to its source, and do all we can to end it once and for all. It's an extension of what I do and what I did as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when I was privileged to chair it in the last Congress, and what I do now as a senior member. When I have a foreign dignitary, a president, prime minister, foreign minister come to visit with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or with me personally, if they represent a country in which I see the rise of anti-Semitism, they do not expect that in my discussion of our bilateral relations, which normally are focused on security and trade and other issues, that I will raise it. But I raise it and say to them, what are you doing about anti-Semitism in your country? Because silence has consequences, words have consequences, and I want them to know that a senior member of the U.S. foreign policy community is interested in what is happening in their country as it relates to anti-Semitism. Now, we all know that we are at a defining moment for the Jewish people, as has been said here many times at this global forum. We all know that this is a critical moment in time, and it's up to you, and it's up to me, and it's up to my congressional colleagues. It's up to the world and community leaders who have participated in this global forum to stand shoulder to shoulder, to meet that defining moment together, proudly, strongly, no matter the odds, no matter the challenges, no matter the threats we face, new or old, to have the strength to embrace a good agreement with Iran if one can be reached, but the courage to reject a bad one if, in fact, it is a bad agreement. And when it comes to the threat of Iran, I have worked for over 20 years. When I was a member of the House of Representatives House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I found out that the United States was giving voluntary contributions to the International Atomic Energy Administration above and beyond our membership dues. And I found out what those voluntary contributions were going for. They were going for creating operational capacity at the Bushehr nuclear facility, not in the national interests of the United States or its security, and certainly not of our ally, the State of Israel. And I led a successful drive to start those voluntary contributions. But for me, that was just the beginning of a long process of staying on the Iran question, even when there were other challenges to our ally Israel. There were other challenges in the world, because I saw a country that had one of the largest reserves of oil and really didn't need, from my perspective, nuclear energy for the purposes of domestic consumption, but was driving towards it. And I know the 5,000-year history that the Persians have had for dominance within that region. And I said to myself, this just simply isn't right. And I would call to those who come to visit me, and I would say to them, why aren't you following Iran? Because that can pose a real challenge. Well, by a combination of other challenges and the world community not coming together in a timely fashion, and by deception, delay, and deceit, Iran ultimately forwarded its nuclear program to the point that they're at the precipice of being a nuclear state. So I have followed this for over 20 years, and I am concerned both in the national security interests of the United States as well as our ally, the State of Israel. That's why I worked with the new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker, to pass the Corker-Menendez legislation, the Iran Nuclear Review Agreement, to give Congress a necessary say and necessary oversight of any agreement between our government and those in Tehran. The fact is, as the chief author of the sanctions legislation that brought Iran to the table, I never envisioned a wholesale waiver of sanctions without congressional input and without congressional action. And I will oppose waiving sanctions on Iran unless Iran verifiably complies with an agreement that we can collectively support. The message I want to send to Tehran is that there is no prize for signing on the dotted line. And there is certainly no prize for further delay, obfuscation, or cheating. And I have serious questions about the framework agreement. No one has worked harder to get to the point to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table. This is not about punishing a country simply for the sake of doing that. There is an end purpose here. But the end purpose must be real. And the framework agreement, of which there are divergent understandings of what that political framework agreement is between the P5+1 and Iran, is worrisome. From the divergent understandings, because there isn't a singular document signed by all of the parties, which allows for the divergent understandings, about the pace of sanctions relief. I'm concerned about Iran's retention of research and development authorities and to what extent they can advance their research and development, because the greater research and development and refinement, for example, of their centrifuges, just to talk in one dimension, means the capacity to enrich at a quicker pace and therefore even reduce the amount of breakout time. I'm concerned about the ability to snap back sanctions if there are violations of an agreement. And while I think such a provision is essential in any agreement, even the efficacy of a good snapback provision of sanctions is questionable. If just a few years down the road, not even the 10 or 15 that is often talked about, but just a few years down the road, the Iranians breach and all the sanctions have been dismissed, and the ability to put those back into effect and the time frame for notice to the international community and to companies to divest themselves and the enforcement of that will be well beyond, in my view, the breakout period of time. I'm concerned about the International Atomic Energy Administration's ability to obtain anytime, anywhere, snap inspections and its capacity to meet expectations, including at Iranian military bases. I'm deeply disturbed that the framework agreement did not speak to the long-established requirement that Iran must come clean, completely clean, on the question of the possible weaponization dimensions of their nuclear program, which they have stonewalled the IAEA from getting access for some time now. And more than anything else, I'm concerned about what will happen when the critical elements of the proposed agreement expire after the first 10 years. Does that mean that we are ultimately destined to have Iran be a nuclear weapon state? That should not be and cannot be the ultimate result. The fact is that the deadline is at the end of this month, and in my view, any deal, to be a good deal, has to be built on more than mothballing Iran's nuclear program, more than on an inspection and verification regime focused on monitoring a one-year breakout capacity. They have a 3-month breakout capacity. So what we're talking about for all of these release without knowing that the framework will bring a conclusive finality to it is an additional 9 months. And what we are potentially giving in return for 9 months, it seems to me, is extraordinarily out of proportion. You can be absolutely certain, based upon the long track record that we have and the world has with Iran, that the mullahs are not going to call us when they decide to breach the agreement. They are going to sneak out covertly, gradually, over time, when they think that we're not looking, just as they have in the past. They're going to parse the words and argue, as they have already, about whether a nuclear advancement technically violates the agreement. For me, it's not a good deal if it leaves Iran as a threshold nuclear state, or if Iran decides to kick out inspectors with impunity. It is not a good deal if Iran can proceed on a covert path and we don't have enough time to do anything other than consider a military option. During this process, from the beginning, the goalposts have continued to move from dismantling Iran's nuclear infrastructure to reconfiguring it. I remember when this first began, and I asked the administration when they came to brief us, what's going to happen to Iraq, the plutonium reactor? And we were told they will either dismantle it or we will destroy it. Iraq is still going to exist, reconfigured, but nonetheless, it's still going to exist. And that which can be reconfigured can ultimately be reconfigured back. I asked what's going to happen with Fordo, the enrichment facility deep inside of a mountain. Now, if you truly are pursuing a peaceful civilian program, you do not have to use your enrichment facilities deep inside of a mountain. That is almost impenetrable. And we were told it would be closed. Now it will continue to be open, but with supposedly more limited capacities and with monitoring. My point is that we have moved rather dramatically, and we have moved to a process in which we are managing Iran's nuclear ambition, which is a dangerous change in American foreign policy, which has focused on stopping nuclear proliferation, not managing it. Managing it invites a whole new world of proliferation that would be an even greater threat, both to our own national security interests as well as to Israel. We have gone from no right to enrich to getting an alarm system. The simple fact is that whatever final agreement may be reached with Iran, it cannot be built on trust and good intentions like the North Korea deal, not when Iran continues to sponsor terrorism, not while it continues to foment terrorism and instability from Yemen to Bahrain, from Iraq to Lebanon, not as events in Syria continue to worsen, a human tragedy of unimaginable proportions, supported, encouraged, and financed by Tehran, not when Iran fires upon and boards commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. That is the Iran we are dealing with. That is the state we are being asked to hope will change in time. But my friends, hope is not a national security strategy, certainly not when it comes to dealing with Iran. Just this week, the truth once again proven elusive when dealing with Iran's unpredictable regime. We saw in the New York Times that international inspectors have reported that Tehran's stockpile of nuclear fuel has increased. It has gone up, not down, up. Now, it may not be a technical violation of the framework agreement, but the Joint Plan of Action called for a reduction in low enrichment uranium supplies before the end of this month. We've known from the beginning this was going to be a challenge, that it was going to be difficult for the Iranians to blend down rather than ship out their supplies of low enriched uranium, which so far they have rejected as an option. I'm concerned that this is just another diplomatic sleight of hand by an untrustworthy negotiating partner. I'm concerned that this is more of an issue than the administration is willing to concede, particularly if the Iranians walk away from a deal with massive amounts of low enriched uranium that can be fed into their centrifuges and converted into highly enriched uranium. So let's be clear. The New York Times has reported on a real problem with the mechanisms being used to control Iran's nuclear stockpile. The simplest solution would be to ship Iran's stockpile out of the country. This would prevent any questionable buildup of material, but Iran has refused. And once again, not to anyone's surprise, opened the potential for Iranian manipulation about what is actually going on. Now, there may be technical reasons for the increase in low enriched uranium, but one certainly has to wonder, are they delaying? Are they really having problems building a conversion facility, something that I specifically expressed concerns about early in the process? Or is this simply another attempt to play fast and loose with the truth, buy time, or use the threat of the increased uranium enrichment as a negotiating tool as we get closer to the deadline? The fact is, midway through the process, we were told it would be a delay, but clearly the timetable has slipped even further away. The fact is, Iran needs to be held responsible for every aspect of the agreement. History has proven that. President Rouhani, in his book, wrote that when he was the Iranian nuclear negotiator, he was able to deceive the West, keep them at bay, as Iran's nuclear program moved forward. Now, this is the person who we supposedly have aspirations and hopes for. But I'm not sure how well I can trust someone who boasts about the ability to deceive the West as you moved your country's nuclear program forward. So this is one of those moments in which the absolute crossing of every T and the dotting of every I is going to be incredibly important. There can be no slippage, no delays, no obfuscation. What happens later when the spotlight is off the press, when the press is gone, when the agreement is out of the headlines, when people have re-engaged, when sanctions relief takes place and people have re-engaged and there's economy flowing to the Iranians, and a country that even with all of the challenges that it has financially between our sanctions, multilateral sanctions, and the drop of oil prices, is still spending a disproportionate amount of its money not to help its people, but to promote terrorism throughout the world. What happens at that moment? What do we do then? And so what this agreement is about is critically important to the national interests and security of the United States, and critically important to the State of Israel, and for that fact, to that entire region. So that is why I am so focused on what this is and question when I believe there are real challenges to it. Let me close by saying why I have been focused on Iran. The fact is that America must always have Israel's back, and that means fighting back against efforts by any nation or any anti-Semitic terrorist group, any haters or Holocaust deniers who try to delegitimize Israel. As some of you may have heard me say at other times, while the Shoah is part of the central identity of Israel's existence, it was never the reason behind its founding, and it is not the main justification for Israel's existence today. The true justification is written in thousands of years of undeniable history that lead to an undeniable conclusion. The reestablishment of the State of Israel in modern time goes back to the time of Abraham and Sarah. The argument for Israel's existence, for its legitimacy, has been forged by the fires of history. It has been nurtured by the blood, sweat, and tears and suffering of the Jewish people, by the courage of generations of men and women who made the desert green, by Nobel Prizes earned, by groundbreaking innovations and enviable institutions, by lives saved, democracy defended, peace made, and battles won. There can be no denying the history or the courage of the Jewish people. And there can be no denying the Jewish people their legitimate right to live in peace and security in the land that has been their home for thousands of years. And that is why I will never yield in my efforts to stop a nuclear Iran and in my support of Israel and that unshakable bond in the national interests of the United States.